be covering the first part of the series on student rights, special education, student rights, and advocacy. So I just want to go over a couple of ground rules for our presentation. We will be doing a 30 to 35 minute presentation, and then at the end of that presentation we'll have a question and answer period. So if you have any questions, please post them in the chat, and during the question and answer period we'll go through those questions. So just want to do an introduction to introduce our speakers on our panel today. My name is Antoinette Williams Dial. I am a staff attorney on the Counsel and Advocacy Law Line with Lakeshore Legal Aid, but more importantly, I am a mom with a student who receives special education services. So my son is a senior in high school, and he has been diagnosed with dyslexia, dysgraphia, ADHD, Asperger's syndrome, and a speech impediment. So we started our journey in special education when he was about 3 years old. We noticed that there were some issues with his speech. He wasn't talking the way most kids his age spoke, and he would only use 1 or 2 word sentences and point to what he wanted. We were advised by our daughter's preschool teacher to get him evaluated for speech and language. So he's had an IEP since preschool. We had him evaluated, and he was able to get into the Michigan Great Start program because of his speech and language delay, and he got speech therapy through that program. So he's had an IEP basically his entire school career, and throughout the years that IEP has changed. We discovered some of his other diagnoses after middle school, so we got all of his complete diagnosis about 8th, 9th grade. That's when we found the dyslexia and the dysgraphia. The school district was doing everything they could, giving him all the supports they could give him. The only issue was they weren't going to go back and teach him to read and write. So we had to figure out how that was going to happen. So when we started this journey, we had no idea about special education services, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to put on this presentation today. Susan?
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Susan Marquardt. I am a mother of 3 young adult women, my youngest of which is neurodivergent. I'm also a supervising attorney for the Counsel and Advocacy Law Line. I've been with Lakeshore Legal Aid for about 15 years now. My family's journey with our child with learning differences and behavioral differences started also around the same age as Antoinette's son, when she was still in childcare, actually in daycare. She had been plugging along, and one day I went to pick her up from daycare, and the head teacher in her room pulled me aside and said, we've noticed some things about your daughter, and nothing to be alarmed about, but just some things, differences in the way she's interacting with other kids or the way she's moving. Have you ever thought about getting her tested? I was a little deer in the headlights about it, not really sure what to make of that. Of course, as a busy mom, I had 2 other kids, hadn't really noticed anything out of the ordinary, but knew that she came from a place of care and concern, and that she had some extra training in early childhood and development training. So we took her up on the offer. She connected us with someone who did some preliminary testing, identified a couple of things about her that might be something she could work on through classes, and we got her into some parent-child classes that we attended with her for about maybe 6 to 8 weeks, and thought we were on our way. Had a lot to do with kind of her coordination and maybe how her brain would process things. So all was well and good. Fast forward a couple years, she starts kindergarten. She's going to the same kindergarten my older 2 daughters went to. We had a really great relationship with the school, knew the teachers, knew the staff. Got a call fairly early on from the school one day that I had to come pick her up. She had put her hands on another child, and they were sending her home. She was being suspended, which kind of blew my mind, a kindergartner being suspended. And, there were no signs, in her home life that this was something to be worried about. But I kind of just, at the moment, thought, well, it's a big transition. She's, sensitive to noises, and crowded, chaotic places can sometimes be tough for her. So, of course, kindergarten's going to take a minute to adjust to, and we went on our way. But the calls continued. I think it was on the third call I got from the school that she was being suspended, that I was at work, and this time she had dumped her carton of milk on a child in the cafeteria, which was really out of character, not something we had seen, and I just knew then and there that this was more. This was something we really had to get our arms around and figure out, and I was so overwhelmed. I did not know what to do. Had a moment. I was at work and sitting at my station, my cube, and upset, and my then boss pulled me aside, pulled me in a room, helped me calm down, and said, have you ever thought about getting your daughter tested, like getting her evaluated? And I knew to trust her. She had kids of her own that I knew had been getting support services. I really respected her, just an amazing person, and she really held my hand, showed me a resource that we're going to share with you later today as well, how to get started in requesting assistance through the school, getting support services for our daughter. So thought we were on our way. We got her tested. It identified some very clear things that we knew we needed to address, and we had our IEP. So we thought we were good to go. But as those of you who have kids in the audience know, it is just a start, and there's so much to getting through the education experience with a child with differences, whatever they be, physical, behavioral, cognitive. And we're really excited to be here to be able to share that, what we've learned in our experience as parents, but also as legal aid attorneys, and how the law impacts our children.
So today's presentation is not intended to be legal advice. It is intended to be informational. So nothing we say today is legal advice. So just want to let everyone know that up front. Now, what we will cover, we will go over where do you start with getting special education services in place, the special education services themselves, understanding the end goal, and additional resources that can help you on your journey. So we're going to reference a lot of terms that are thrown around a lot in the realm of special education. So we wanted to go through some of those key terms with you. We may not use all of them during our conversation, but we wanted to be sure that everyone had an understanding of what the terms are. So the first term is FAPE, which is the acronym for Free Appropriate Public Education. The second term is IEP, which is an Individualized Education Program. LRE is Least Restrictive Environment, so the least restrictive educational environment possible, which is generally the general education classroom. MET, the Multidisciplinary Evaluation Team, and that's the team that conducts the evaluations to determine whether or not a child needs special education services. READ, Review of Existing Evaluation Data. Reads generally occur about every 3 years. And PLAF, this is a term that you may have heard a lot in your IEP reviews with your child's teachers and service providers. PLAF stands for Present Level of Academic Achievement and Functional Performance. So the PLAF looks at where the child is currently, and that is used to drive the services that the IEP is built with.
So the foundational right that children have is to a free and appropriate public education. This is not optional. These rights exist for our children in public schools and in charter schools, which are really a form of public schools. And those rights to a free and appropriate education for all children in those settings are available and supported under both state and federal law. the federal law provides special education services for children from the ages of 3 to 21. However, states can confer greater rights to students, and we happen to be in a pretty progressive state where that's concerned. Michigan actually provides special education services for children from the age of birth to 26. States have to comply with federal law, but like I said, they can add greater benefits and rights to children.
And I always count myself lucky that I live in a state that will provide special education services for a child from birth through the age of 26, because some students who have cognitive abilities that are severely impaired, it may take until age 26 to get them ready to go out into the world.
Yeah, and you also, there's so much that can be done the sooner you catch things and begin providing support for a child. So again, like the more you can do, the earlier and sometimes longer, the better.
So in order to have special education services or get an IEP, under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, there are 2 criteria that have to be met. So one, the child has to have a disability. And a disability does not necessarily mean physical disability. It could be any type of disability, whether it's physical, mental, learning, emotional, any type of disability. 2, there has to be a need. So the child has to have a disability, and that disability has to negatively impact their ability to learn and perform in the classroom. There are some children who have disabilities but don't have a need for special education services because they're able to perform well. So where do you start with getting special education services in place? That's the question most people ask themselves.
So the place most people are familiar with, the academic aspect of a child's learning. Are they struggling with their assignments? Are they struggling on their tests? But you also want to take a look at if your child is struggling behaviorally. A child can be performing okay academically, but really struggling behaviorally, and maybe they're missing opportunities to learn more, they're impacting others' learning, so there are supports that can be put in place based on a child's behavioral differences, and then there's plenty of accommodations that can be established for a child with physical differences as well.
It's like behavioral issues doesn't always mean that the child is misbehaving. Sometimes it means that there's something going on that the school doesn't see. Disabilities can be invisible. So just because the child looks perfectly fine physically doesn't mean that they don't have an invisible disability that's affecting their ability to function in the classroom. Children with ADHD, they look just like every other child, but the child with ADHD can't focus. Any little thing will throw them off. That's one of the issues my son had. Any little thing in the classroom would cause him to stop focusing on the teacher and his schoolwork and focus on the other things going on. So the radiator going off in the class, another kid clicking a pencil, the door opening, that would stop him from focusing on what he needed to address in class, and he'd be focused on those issues.
And that lack of focus, just to build on that a little bit, lack of focus, because my child has ADHD as well, is that can present in so many different ways that aren't always really obvious. It's not the classic kid that's hyperactive. It can present in ways where the kid appears bored or tired or disinterested, and it's not always as obvious. So like you said, the disability sometimes is not always visible and obvious to all that are out there. So as a parent or as an advocate, it's our job to kind of bring that to the attention of our educators and make sure that there's accommodations built into their plans to address that.
So
in terms of where do you start? Like where do you begin in the process? So the first step is to really request an evaluation in writing. You want to not rely on your conversation with a teacher alone or a principal. You want to put that in writing. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are some nice resources out there in the ways of template letters, but the letters should be addressed to the Director of Special Education Services. At a minimum, that title should be included. If you're not sure of the name of who covers that, you could call your administrative office and just ask for the name, or you could do a Google search. But it's just real important that it be in writing and directed to that person, the Director of Special Education Services. You're going to want to sign and date your request, and the school is going to, once you submit that, it kicks into play this very strict legal requirement that they must respond within 30 days to your request.
And sometimes it may be a little difficult to find out who the Director of Special Education Services is. There are some districts, I'm not going to name names, who kind of play a shell game with the Special Education Services Department. You can find who the Director of Special Education Services is by looking on the district's website. You may have to go through each department and read the description of what that department does to figure out which department handles special education services. But once you find that department, then you can go to that department's page, and you will get a list of who the director is, who the deputy director is, and you'll be able to identify the right person that way, because sometimes it won't say special education services, it'll say something else, but when you read the description, it'll mention key terms like IEP or 504 plan or special education. Then you know you've got the right person, the right department. So once you have submitted your request, the school has to evaluate the child to determine whether or not they would qualify for special education services. And there's two types of plans that could be put in place. There's a 504 plan under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and then there's the IEP, Individualized Education Plan, under the IDEA. So just curious how your process went for when you requested services from your district.
That is a really good question. So I think once we made that initial request for our services, I think things moved pretty smoothly, and we were fortunate our school district was very compliant in making sure that they followed all the steps as required under law. But with that said, our daughter had been struggling for a while with some really obvious signs of concern, and which I'm sure were obvious to the teacher, and the school didn't necessarily initiate this conversation. We had to, so yeah.
Now, there are some differences between a 504 plan and an IEP plan. So, like I said earlier, IEPs are governed by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and 504 plans are governed by the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. They are very different, and in some ways you get more protections with an IEP under the IDEA than you do with a 504 plan. The IEP requires that there is a review of the IEP every year and a reevaluation every 3 years. Parents must be allowed to participate in putting together the IEP plan. With a 504 plan, the review is as reasonable or as appropriate. There's no real definition of what appropriate is, so it's like, okay, are we talking about every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, every 3 years? And the placement for a 504 plan is the general education classroom, and parents are not necessarily allowed to participate in putting together the 504 plan. You may be consulted, but the final decision is up to the individuals who are putting that plan together in the school district. So, not saying that there is anything wrong with a 504 plan. Both plans can be useful depending on the child's needs. So I won't say that a 504 plan is bad, because there are some students who don't qualify for special education services, but they need some reasonable accommodations or some extra help in the classroom that a 504 plan will be able to help them get. So it depends on the child and their needs.
And also, for IEPs, there are 13 categories of disabilities that are recognized under the IDEA. So it's possible that a child may have some kind of difference that isn't actually captured under IDEA, which then would, then the other opportunity would be a 504 plan. There's no, the Section 504 continues beyond school age in terms of rights for students, so it continues into college. But just a side point, now having a child in college too, I've experienced this, is that they don't talk about 504 plans in college. IEPs are not an option in college. 504 plans aren't discussed, but you can get accommodations in college under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act.
So when you are trying to get special education services in place, you need to provide documentation to support the child's need for special education services. So you need records, health records, but you want to be careful about the health records. So evaluations from doctors or the pediatric neurologist that evaluated your child and identified the disability, school records, report cards, discipline reports. Report cards can kind of be a double-edged sword, because if the child is getting A's and B's, then it looks like they don't need any education services because they're getting A's and B's. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't an issue that needs to be addressed, or that the child could be doing better if you look further than just he's getting A's and B's.
Also, think about too, if you've moved schools, there people. I find when we're taking calls from people with these issues with their school districts, they have an assumption sometimes that if they move school districts, that the school district has all that same information, they have all those records, and that's not how that works. It's really on you to make sure that those records get transferred. I mean, in a well-functioning, fully communicating system, that should happen, but it doesn't. It oftentimes does not. So keep in mind your school records. You may need to carry. You need to initiate the request to get them brought into your IEP request in a new school district. Also, where health records are concerned, anything you can do to get records from a specialist can really go a long way. I talk to a lot of people who have kind of relied on their primary care physician, their pediatrician, and they are really important parts of our family's medical team. But sometimes they don't carry the same credibility that a specialist might. So if you have the ability to get care from a specialist for your child, that can really go a long way in kind of helping move the needle in getting a school to take seriously your need or your child's need for special education support.
Yeah, when we were trying to get my son's IEP changed, one of the things we did was we went and had a full neuropsych exam done by a pediatric neurologist, and once the exam was done, I provided a copy of that pediatric neurologist report to the school district to show, okay, he's been diagnosed with dyslexia, dysgraphia, and Asperger's syndrome. What else can we do to make sure that his IEP is meeting all of his needs at this point in time?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And know that when you're going down this path, the school can do their own testing and evaluations. And there is a real bias in school systems to not always find the same level of difference or challenge in learning that we might, or our private care providers or evaluators might find. These laws really hold schools accountable in a certain way, and they are required to bring extra resources to the table. It's not an option to say they don't have a staff person available to help provide the accommodations that are reasonable. It's really on them to figure that out from a budgetary standpoint, and we know schools are really challenged these days with budgets. So just be mindful, anything you can do to bring your own records that are independent of what a school might do on their own is probably going to be helpful to you.
And a lot of times those evaluations from specialists will also have suggestions or recommendations for accommodations that can be put in place for the child in school, which can be used to help build the child's IEP or 504 plan.
Super helpful. Yeah, that's a really, really good point, that they can oftentimes have great ideas about the right accommodations to fit your child's needs. So, kind of moving on to the kinds of services you can get, I think many of us have maybe seen where a child's getting extra help in the classroom, maybe some special tutoring that they're getting. An accommodation can include the provision of a paraprofessional in the classroom. They call them parapros. Even all the way up to a parapro being assigned to your child throughout the day, if that's what the child needs. They can look at providing special support while your child's in the general ed classroom with all students. You know, we talked about under FAPE the free and appropriate education, and that it's in the least restrictive environment. So if there's a way of keeping your child in the general education classroom and still providing those supports, that's what the schools are supposed to do. But as all of our schools have resource room staff, sometimes that works better for some children. So being some careful consideration about where your child is going to be able to best learn. You know, you'll see some schools that really kind of push kids into the resource room. Some do the opposite, want to keep them in the general education classroom. But at the end of the day, you want to think, and the school should be thinking about what is best for your child. There can be a request for summer school support in your child's plan. It's something I wasn't aware of. We have a child in our neighborhood that's autistic that his parents pushed for this and had this ultimately added to his IEP. He really struggled when he came home over the summer because his routine was disrupted, and they would spend so much time getting him back up to speed. They were able to get summer school added so that he kept up with his learning and his process throughout the summer. It really made a big difference. I think Antoinette has some thoughts on that too.
Well, when my son was in elementary school, middle school, and high school, I had him go to summer school, and one of my concerns was during the summer he would lose a lot of the information he learned during the school year, so I wanted to figure out a way to keep that summer slip from happening, because for students with disabilities, summer slip can be a real danger. So I was talking to his teacher, and she was like, well, he has an IEP. He can go to summer school for free. All you have to do is ask. So I made a deal with my son, because he wasn't trying to go to summer school, but I made a deal with my son. It's like, okay, you go to summer school this summer, and next summer you won't have to go to summer school. We'll do it every other year until he got to high school, and then I made him do summer school every year, just because he needed to be able to keep working on those academic skills during the summer, so he wouldn't lose some of the gains he got during the school year. So summer school can be great for some kids, and for some kids they need time off.
One other thing too that was new to me, and I think an interesting area that I don't think probably gets explored enough, but in terms of services you can bring to the table to help support your child, a part of an IEP can include skills training for you as a parent. So that's something, or a guardian, so that's something to think about requesting if there's, you know, some type of area in your child's educational experience that you feel like you just don't know what to do, how to handle it. That's something you can maybe think about requesting be built into their plan. In terms of some of the programs that are out there to help our younger children, there's some nice resources. There's a program called Early on Michigan that allows for interventive services for children as young as 0 to 3 years of age. It can really help a child identify a child when they're still developing, before they even get to preschool, and provide some extra supports. There's a program called Head Start that you may have heard of. It's a federally funded program that's out there for low-income families, picks up at the age of 3 and continues until a child would start school. And then there's also the Great Start Readiness Program that's state funded, that picks up at 4, and that does not, there's no income requirements for that, so it's available to all.
Yeah, my son did the Great Start Readiness Program, and it was phenomenal because he was able to get his speech and language therapy through the program and be in a classroom. It was half the day, but that speech and language therapy really helped with his developing speech skills, and having it identified early gave us the ability to get him ready to go to school and be able to talk in more than 1 or 2 word sentences and point at what he wants. Because when you get to kindergarten, the kindergarten teacher has 20 other kids, and she's not trying to figure out what he wants, because all he's doing is pointing. So some people ask why special education services matter. Now, special education today is not what it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. A lot of you have to realize that special education services really started in like 1975. So it's still very young. It's not even 50 years old. Today it's different. And why is it important? Because we need to be able to prepare our children to face the world and interact with the world rather than protect them from the world. Because eventually that child is going to grow up, become 18, and mom and dad, if they are cognitively capable of running their own life, mom and dad aren't going to be able to handle everything for them, and they have to be prepared to handle being in the working world, being in social situations, and advocating for themselves when they're employed and in college so that they can get the help and services they need to be successful in whatever endeavors they choose. The only way to do that is to make sure that they are getting that help in primary school. So one of the things I always tried to look at was the end goal for my son. I had to check my own biases and realize that it wasn't about me, it was about him and what he needed and the tools that I could put in place for him so that he could grow and succeed, because I'm not going to be there every day and I can't be there every minute of the day. So I had to make sure that when he is an adult, he's prepared to face the world on his own 2 feet with just some support from mom and dad.
And another thing I noticed with my own child is that, that in terms of the goal setting, that included her as she got older. She became more involved in that goal setting too, which was really nice. And it took me a minute, because being the mama bear and the helicopter parent, I wanted to, be doing that myself. But I realized, after a couple gentle nudges, I guess, by some of the support staff, like, hey, let's get her involved in this too. And it was absolutely the right thing to do, and let her start to drive the bus.
So you need to set your short-term goals, your long-term goals, and put a plan in place to achieve them. Whether long-term goal is independent living and career, or living in a home for others with disabilities and part-time employment.
So you need to think about specifically where your child needs help. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but just going to touch on this in a slightly different way here. Of course, are there academic supports needed, behavioral supports, physical supports? But one area that I find crosses over into a lot of different differences that I don't think gets nearly enough attention in our schools, and we as parents and legal advocates need to do more to really highlight and get built into a child's plan, is children that struggle with executive functioning. That has to do with how they process information, how they organize information. For whatever reason, I found this to be a real struggle to get schools to fully consider that. It was something I brought up at every single one of my daughter's parent-teacher conferences, and there are plenty of really nice accommodations you can request around executive functioning, whether it be an app that supports organization and planning, a physical planner, reminders from the teachers, from the staff, but it should be incorporated, not just a tool that is given to a child and expected for them to incorporate and use on their own. It's supposed to be supported by the school too.
Yeah, most likely the absent-minded professor, the reason he couldn't remember how to get to appointments on time was because he had problems with executive functioning. He could do his research, but he couldn't run his life.
Mm-hmm.
So when you are talking about transitioning out of primary school, you need to look at, okay, what are your child's post-primary school goals and goals for adulthood? Is your child going to go to college? Are they going to go to trade school? Are they going to go into employment? For adulthood, are they going to live completely independent? Are they going to live in assisted living, a group or supportive housing? Or are they going to live at home with family? These are all considerations that go into your long-term goals for your child. For my son, he's going to go to trade school after he graduates from high school, and at some point, he will live on his own independently from mom and dad, but not for a few years.
This is an area where there's a real gap in support for kids with differences as they move kind of from primary school onward. But I'm noticing that it seems like there's more energy around those resources out there, and hopefully more things coming about for anybody in Wayne County. There's a organization called the Living and Learning Center that I know is doing really great things in helping transition kids through that transition phase, and whatever that looks like for them.
Now, when you are putting in place a special education services plan, there is the special education team. The parent is an important part of that team. You are the CEO of your child's special education team. Then there is the district special education department, teachers, paraprofessionals, social workers, and healthcare professionals. But as the parent, you are the CEO. You are the one piloting this ship. If it's on autopilot, it may go off course. It won't be able to change course when necessary if a storm comes up. So you have to be basically the CEO of your child's special education team and your child's biggest advocate.
Yeah, you'll see. We talk to people all the time, which is always surprising to me, where they aren't even included in the plans or the meetings. So, can't emphasize enough how important it is that you are absolutely should be included and need to be included as part of your child's team, and making sure that they're getting all the support resources they can.
So, with being the CEO of your child's special education team, you need to become an expert on their disabilities and their needs. You also need to maintain a good written file and notes, and build good working relationships with the schools and the teachers. And as Susan said earlier, include your child in the process when and where it makes sense. So as they get older, they should be included in those discussions about their disability and their needs, and how do you feel your IEP is helping you? Are there any areas that you're struggling in that we need to address? And being present at the IEP review meetings so that you can be the voice for your child.
And know that, it's normal to have things not always go perfectly smoothly. I mean, you will have times where you don't always see eye to eye with the school, but just remember that at the end of the day, unless you're planning to move, you have to still work with these people. So you don't want to be scorching that earth and, burning bridges. You want to try and work your way through it as peacefully as you can. So we did have a little quick reference here of the laws, and we've touched on these. I'm not going to read the list to you. You can see it in the slide, but there are both state and federal laws that support the things that we're talking about. We are going to have some other resources that we will direct you to at the end of our presentation, where you can learn more about these things.
So if you need help drafting letters, either to request an IEP review, or to request that your child be evaluated for special education services, there are a number of organizations that have sample template letters that you can use, like Michigan Legal Help or the Student Advocacy Center. So at this time, we are going to open our question and answer session.
Thank you, Antoinette and Susan. This is such valuable information. Looking at the chat, I don't see any questions yet, but we do have a few offline questions for our presenters. First one, what if the school recommends a 504 plan, but the parent wants an IEP? Can the parent force the school to do an IEP over a 504 plan?
The school should be evaluating for both. So if you are making a request for special education services, and the sample letters that links to those templates for sample letters, I think we'll say that in there, they should be absolutely evaluating for an IEP. But as I mentioned before, it's not, IEPs are a little bit more narrow, I guess, in what students they'll capture, even though most can be captured through an IEP. So it's possible you may have a child that just doesn't fit the criteria. There's 13 areas of disability that an IEP can cover. So it's possible that maybe your child wouldn't necessarily qualify for a 504. But we touched a little bit earlier too on how 504 plans can be very effective, but they're a little less structured. They have a little less teeth in them in terms of the timelines and the structure and the accountability. So you do find where schools will sometimes only talk about 504 plans or only suggest 504 plans. So as your child's parent or guardian, you absolutely are within your right to request and that they be considered for an IEP plan.
And
as well.
if you don't agree with the evaluation results, you can request in writing that a reevaluation be done. You can also request an independent evaluation be done by someone other than the school district.
At the school's expense too, if you're unable to afford it yourself. And there is a whole process we're not even touching on here today, that if you disagree with the school's findings, whether your child needs an IEP or 504 plan, or the type of IEP or 504 plan, or the type of accommodations, there's a whole process to challenge those things. Lakeshore Legal Aid and the Council Advocacy Law Line has attorneys that are trained. We have resources available to help educate people and sometimes advocate for people on how to make those types of challenges. But that's not really something we've captured in today's presentation, but we're happy to help with that, and we'll have a way for you to connect with us after the presentation.
Great, thank you so much. Next offline question, does an IEP or 504 plan carry over into school-sponsored extracurricular activities?
Yes, it does. An IEP or 504 plan with an IEP, it is to be used in every aspect of the educational process. So in the classroom, in the lunchroom, on field trips, doing after-school activities like clubs and sports. It follows the child throughout the school day.
So the accommodations too can be specific to some of those activities. My daughter had a accommodation in her IEP that for field trips we could travel separately. We didn't have to travel on the school bus, which if anybody who's done a field trip on a school bus know how chaotic and crazy that can be. So that was a nice thing that we were able to do. And when there was assemblies, she had an accommodation where she was sitting by the teacher off to the side in the quieter part of the area where they did assemblies. So yeah, they incorporate those extracurricular activities, and your accommodations can be specific to those extracurricular activities too.
Yeah, assemblies were horrible for my son with his ADHD, so we had accommodations for him for what they would do when they were in an assembly, and if he needed to leave in order to have some quiet time to basically de-stress because of all of the noise and activity in the assembly, they would give him like a 5-10 minute break.
Great, thank you. And just checking the chat, I don't see any questions, but we still have a couple offline questions. Are IEPs or 504 plans public, and can anyone ask to see them?
No, they are not public. Just like your child's school records are not public, an IEP and a 504 plan are not public, the school still has to protect your child's privacy rights. So the only ones who can see the IEP plan are district employees, individuals who work in the school district who are providing services for your child, the parents, of course, but not everybody can see the plans. And a lot of times other parents and students don't even know your child has an IEP or a 504 plan in place unless you yourself mention it to them.
Great. It looks like we've got time for a couple more questions here. So what if the school isn't following through with its obligations under the IEP or 504 plan? What options does the parent have?
Well, with the IEP, that is the IDEA is very clear on what happens if the school is not following the law. You can file a complaint. You can either file a complaint with the special education department in your school district. If you don't get any results there, you can escalate it up to the Department of Education, or you can go to the Federal Department of Education. With 504 plans, you can file a complaint, but the rules aren't as stringent as with an IEP. But you can file a complaint if they're not following your 504 plan. You can start with your principal, and then you're not getting anywhere there, go to the Director of Special Education Services.
I would say if they're not following your IEP and you've already pushed back on staff, I think I might start with the Director of Special Education Services, but then copy the staff on your request. But requesting a meeting just to review your IEP or 504 plan is something you always have as an option. So maybe that's like the first thing you do, and then from there, if you're getting nowhere, you can start filing complaints. But you know, it gets obviously a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for, you know, sides begin forming. So that's obviously not the first place you want to go, but you absolutely have a right, and it should be meeting with your school on a semi-regular basis. I know sometimes people have the idea that with these plans, it's only a once-a-year thing, but that's not at all, does not have to be the case. It should be what's best for your child. So maybe meeting once a semester is more appropriate, or you know, the communication itself can be part of the IEP. So just keep that in mind too.
And it also depends on the severity of the violation. If they're just not enacting the IEP at all, then you want to
Yeah.
have a conversation with the school. Sometimes it may be that certain parts of it aren't being implemented, but the teacher didn't know because they didn't read the IEP, didn't realize that there were accommodations that were supposed to be made for this child under their 504 or IEP plan. So I would advise that at the beginning of every school year, or every semester if your child is in middle school or high school, you talk with the child's teachers and let them know, hey, my son has a 504 plan, my son has an IEP, have you read it? Do you know the accommodations he's supposed to get?
Absolutely, that's such a good point, and we struggled with that too sometimes, just making sure that staff was familiar with it going from one year to the next, or even teacher goes out on leave and you have a substitute that comes in. You know, the school should be making sure that happens, but that's not always quite how that works. So
Yeah, there are a lot of moving parts during the school day and a lot of moving personnel, and not everybody is cognizant of what's going on with each and every student.
Great, thank you. Looks like we've got time for one more question. It was mentioned that you can request an independent evaluation, and it sounds like there's different evaluations taking place through this process. Who pays for these evaluations?
Well, when you request that your child be evaluated for special education services, the district pays for having their personnel evaluate the child. So, and it depends on what the issues are. So they may have the speech and language therapist evaluate the child for speech and language. They may have the occupational therapist evaluate the child for occupational therapy. They may have the social worker evaluate the child for social behavioral services. So it depends on what type of evaluation it is. If you're doing a neuropsych evaluation where you're trying to figure out what all of your child's disabilities may be, because students with disabilities, a lot of times it's not just one. A lot of students have multiple disabilities that are interacting. For a neuropsych evaluation, that is done by a medical professional, so the parent would have to pay for that. Sometimes your health insurance will cover the cost. They may not cover all of it, but the only way to get a complete evaluation of what your child's disabilities are is through a neuropsych exam, because they'll look at everything from social, emotional, academic, physical. They'll look at all of those issues, and if they need to do a deeper dive on one or two areas, they'll do a deeper dive and then give you a evaluation. Okay, this is what we found.
but you can, if you're not able to, if you dispute the school's evaluation, you're not able to afford your own, you can request that the school pay for the evaluation too on their dollar, and they have to hire somebody other than the people that they use to do their own evaluation to do it again, to do a separate evaluation. So really at the end of the day, the only thing that you should be paying for out of pocket is whatever evaluations you want to bring to the table independently, which if you can, it is better because you have your own, you control that, you control the professionals you're asking to do it, but you are not paying for applying for an IEP or 504 plan. You're not paying for them to bring parapros into the classroom or to add these extra services that your child receives. As long as it's reasonable, it's something that the school has to foot the bill for, which is part of where there's that tension, if you will, in this whole process, because schools are always mindful of their resources and, trying to protect and make do with what they have. But these kinds of, when kids come to them that need these extra supports, they're legally obligated to provide those supports, and that's not your problem as a parent or family member take care of their budgetary challenges.
Great, thank you both again. And just for our audience, can you share with them the additional resources and how they would get a hold of you if they're looking for services?
For some reason, I don't have anything past that in there. If you want to cover that.
So, sorry.
So if you have questions or you want to ask questions specific to your child and your child's needs, you can contact the Counsel and Advocacy Law Line. You can also submit an online intake through Michigan Legal Help, and someone from the Counsel and Advocacy Law Line will call you back in response to that online intake.
Yeah, we are open. The Counsel and Advocacy Law Line is open Monday through Friday. Our hours are listed above, but we go through an eligibility process to make sure you qualify for our services, and then from there we'll do an intake, and an attorney will assist you over the phone as best they can, and then sometimes we move our cases along to our litigation offices, where sometimes, not always, sometimes we have attorneys that are available to go into the schools or even courts if need be. But that's a limited resource. That's not something that's guaranteed or promised for each call. There's also other resources that if you look at the link, the code that we've provided in this presentation, it's going to take you to other resources, and there's some great resources in the area out there. Agencies that will support you, will go with you to these meetings sometimes, and really strongly encourage you to take advantage of that. Both Antoinette and I have used those resources ourselves and had really good luck with that. So just know that those are available also.
So there are other agencies that assist parents with students with disabilities, like the, I'm forgetting the name of it, Michigan, and I use them all the time.
Disability Rights Center? ARC?
Nope, MIAF, Michigan. You'll find them on the landing page. They provide a lot of services for parents with students with disabilities, including a course on the IEP and each section of the IEP, so that you can evaluate whether or not your child's IEP is addressing all of their needs, and you understand what you're discussing when you go into an IEP review meeting with teachers and staff.
Maybe we could go back to the slide with the questions with the couple of QR codes.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. These codes will take you to our landing page, where you're going to find the contact, the names and the contacts of the agencies that we're referring to. Very helpful in many ways. The template letters we've talked about, support going into the meetings, guidance. A lot of the things we've talked about, you'll find information on these very same things on their page, on their websites.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you both again, Antoinette and Susan. This was really great information for our audience. That will end part 1 of our 3-part series, and I thank everyone for joining us. Please come back, though, for part 2 on March 22nd, same time, 1 to 2 p.m., when we will be talking about school discipline. Thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.